On behalf of the American Society of International Law, I would like to welcome you to today's webcast, U.S. Obligations Toward Refugees. I'm Lucinda Lowe, the president of the American Society of International Law, and we are here at Tiller House, the headquarters of the Society in Washington, D.C. Our event today is the fifth in a series the Society has organized on international law and the Trump administration. Prior programs in this series have covered international agreements, trade, the environment, and the United Nations. They are all available on our website, www.asil.org, under 100 days in either webcast or podcast form, and they are free of charge. The Society is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization founded in 1906. Our mission is to educate about international law and to promote international relations on the basis of law and justice. And this webcast series is in furtherance of that mission. With the conflict in Syria, the world has been forced to confront the issue of refugees as never before, as literally millions of people have been displaced or have fled and sought refuge in other countries. In the United States, the issue of refugee resettlement has come to the fore in the Trump administration and during the campaign that preceded it, as President Trump expressed concerns about refugees coming into the United States. And of course, the world is familiar with the two executive orders that the administration has issued, which thus far have been blocked by the courts, that would suspend all refugee admissions. Our webcast series is designed to provide information to people around the world who want to have a better understanding of these issues, especially from the standpoint of international law. We are fortunate to have with us today as speakers and as a moderator, people who have deep knowledge about and expertise with these issues, from having worked on them both in government and in the private sector and academia. As with our prior programs in this series, our panelists have served in both Republican and Democratic administrations. As they will be introduced by our moderator, I will not go into their backgrounds in detail, but I'd like to thank them and our moderator, Jane Stromseth, for joining us today. Jane is a professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center and also served as deputy to the ambassador at large in the Office of Global Criminal Justice at the State Department. So let me thank them, and let me also thank the Society's Executive Director, Mark Agrast, our Deputy Executive Director, Wes Riss, and all of our staff for their work on this project. And now let me turn the program over to our moderator, Jane Stromseth, to introduce our speakers. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you so much, Lucinda, for your introduction and for the Society's leadership in hosting this valuable discussion series. I'd also like to say a warm welcome to our viewers who have joined us virtually for this program. Today, our focus will be on U.S. international legal obligations towards refugees. We know that many millions of people all around the world are fleeing desperate situations. Many are fleeing persecution, armed conflict, or other dangerous situations. Some cross national borders, while others are internally displaced within their own countries. Some are crossing borders to seek better economic opportunities. Some are unaccompanied children. And we're very fortunate today to have two expert panelists with exceptional experience to help us explore and better understand who today's refugees are and what international law requires in how states treat them, as well as how the United States makes decisions about refugee admission and protection. And we'll also discuss some of the current controversial issues, including those raised by recent executive orders, while also exploring whether there are priorities and reforms that might enjoy bipartisan support. And we're very fortunate today to have two leading experts who bring a vast array of experience to these questions. Alex Alenikov is the former United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees. He's a leading scholar of refugee and immigration law. He also served as General Counsel of the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service. Currently, He is director of the Zollberg Institute on Migration and Mobility and university professor at the New School in New York. Thank you, Alex, for being with us. Sam Whitten has held leadership positions at the U.S. Department of State, including serving as Deputy Legal Advisor, the Principal Deputy and Acting Assistant Secretary for Population, Refugees, and Migration, and he is currently counsel at the law firm of Arnold & Porter, Kay Scholler, here in Washington, D.C. So welcome to both of you. We're delighted to have you with us. I'd like to start, Alex, with you. Could you tell us a bit about who today's refugees are and what international law requires of countries, including the United States, in their treatment of refugees?
Yeah. So there are about 65 million people around the world displaced because of conflict and violence. About 2/3 of them stay in their country of origin, and they're called internally displaced people. To be a refugee, you need to cross an international border. And there are about 20 million, 21 million refugees. About 5 million are Palestinian refugees, and another 5 million are Syrian refugees. This number is the largest it's been at any time since World War II. So we're facing a large movement of people both inside their country and outside their country. The governing international law here is the Convention on the Status of Refugees, adopted in 1951, and now more than 140 countries are members of the convention or protocol that was adopted in 1967. And it does several things. The convention first defines a refugee as someone who, outside their country, who has fled and fears persecution based on race, religion, national origin, membership in a social group, or political opinion if they go home. And then it establishes a set of rights for refugees. So refugees who get to another country are supposed to be given a right to work, to move within that country, to right to an education, to free exercise of religion, and things like that. And then it has a very strong and important promise of non-return, which is called non-refoulement in French, but it means that a person who fears going back would not be sent back because of fear of one of those grounds. As I say, most countries of the world have signed this convention. The problem is that the rights are not enforced in most states. So states either permit refugees in, but then don't give them a right to work, or kids are not in school, or they try to prevent refugees from coming altogether, as many of the states of the global north have erected barriers, which then can cause their return to places where they're not protected.
And just in terms of the practical challenges that refugees face when they flee their countries and arrive in another country, Sam, could you say a bit about that?
Sure, I'll be happy to. Well, Alex has identified this worldwide phenomenon of people having to leave their home state, I'll call it state A, to go to state B for their own protection, and they can't return. There are so many different fact patterns here, most of which are really quite frightening and difficult. The refugees often are separated from their families, from their loved ones. They're in a place where they don't have a community, they don't have jobs, their children are alone from their friends and from relations. It's a very difficult situation by any measure. And as Alex noted, the Refugee Convention does contemplate that the host state, the state of first refuge, where the first asylum, where the refugees go, has certain obligations. That's easier said than done in many cases. A lot of host states that receive refugees are themselves in difficult straits. Their populations don't necessarily welcome refugees coming in. Their populations don't understand, nor do the refugees, how long they'll be there. And often there are resources that are extremely limited: health, education, public safety, jobs. And refugees are, frankly, after a short period of time, if they're going to be staying in the country of first asylum, they're competing for these limited resources with the local population. So not only are refugees separated from their communities, their jobs, their homes, their language of origin, but they're in a complicated situation where they're often not welcomed. So it puts a lot of pressure on host governments to figure out what to do. And no two situations are the same, but the host governments have a certain responsibility, as Alex explained, under the Refugee Convention. They also have an obligation to their own citizens. So these people are coming often separated and lonely and in a difficult way. Sort of a high level and we could give you some examples of these populations and the way in which that they are met and have difficulty or success.
Well, you describe, both of you, many of the challenges, and I'm interested in whether, Alex, you mentioned that the Refugee Convention and the protocol are now about 50 years old, and that framework was developed under quite different circumstances. And so it really raises the question whether the international legal framework is adequate to the complexities we face today, and if there is a need for reforms. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts about that in light of the kinds of challenges that you both identified.
Well, let's say two things about that. First of all, the international practice has exceeded the convention in the following way. Many of the people who flee violence and conflict can't demonstrate that they've been targeted for persecution, which was sort of the idea that when the convention was first written. But nonetheless, they're treated as refugees. So for the 4 or 5 million Syrians who have fled to Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey and elsewhere, there haven't been any hearings, there haven't been any adjudications in those countries about whether they come within the narrow definition, as there would be if they got to the United States. So they'd go through almost a judicial proceeding to determine whether or not they meet the definition. They're categorized as refugees and treated as refugees by the international community. So in that way, practice has exceeded the convention in a good way, and people think that's a good idea. On the other side, I think the real flaw in the convention was the convention did not establish a system of international responsibility sharing. So 90% of the world's refugees just cross one border. They go next door. Their country falls apart. They're threatened with violence. They go next door and they stay. Now, if the conflict were to end quickly, no problem, they'd go home. But these conflicts last for a very long time. None of the major conflicts causing refugee flows now look like they're about to end. And that's Syria, Yemen, Central African Republic, Northern Nigeria. You can go around the world and point to these. That means people are in these countries, and the rest of the world really has not taken up its share of taking the burden of the refugees. So Lebanon, a country of 4 million people, has taken in more than 1 million refugees. And that the convention didn't establish a system for responsibility sharing, and that really needs to be thought about now as we move forward so this can be more equitably shared.
Just to add a comment, I agree with Alex on that, how challenging it is, because people often move, they have a hope that they'll go back, but in fact, they often get stuck either in a camp or just in limbo. They may be in an urban setting in the country of first asylum, but in any event, it's a real challenge for them to figure out how to survive. But the one point about the Refugee Convention and the way international attitudes have developed, we have the classic refugee, we have economic migrants, we have internal displacement. There's the many millions number that Alex noted is a whole hybrid. And one thing that the United States has faced as a challenge, it's that there's a bit of a bifurcation. We have the Refugee Admissions Program, which is an orderly immigration program where refugees are typically referred to the United States by the UN, Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. They may be referred from embassies, they may be referred from nonprofits. But then on our southwest border, we have many that are not iconic refugees. They're not necessarily fleeing persecution, although some are. They're economic migrants. And one thing that I've noticed, particularly since I've left government and in light of the recent discussion in the last couple of years, is that there really is no clear definition. People talk about refugees simply as people who've moved across borders. And one of the issues that policymakers face is, how do we treat economic migrants that really can't go back because of violence, but they're not here under the classic Refugee Convention definition? Do we ask them to leave? Do we provide for them anyway? And there's no single answer to that, but it's an important policy consideration.
Alex, do you want to comment on that?
No, I think there are many reasons people leave countries. On the southwest border, I think in this recent flow of Central Americans from the so-called Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the majority of people are moving because of fear and because of danger. So the UNHCR did a study a couple of years ago and found that 60% of the people fleeing, maybe more, had protection needs of some kind. Many of these are young men who fear gang violence and would be killed if they returned. Other people involved with domestic abuse issues. So I wouldn't categorize these as economic migrants, although I think Sam is right to say that the narrow definition may not easily cover these groups. So we need to think about expanding the norms for people who need protection, of which there may be categories. Climate is another example. There'll be millions of people who will move primarily within their country, some across borders, because of climate change, desertification, or floods or the like. And we need systems. International law needs to respond with norms of protection. And most of those people who'll be moving, I would not categorize as economic migrants. They have protection needs, even if they don't come within the 1950 definition of refugee.
But you're saying that UNHCR treats a lot of people de facto as refugees, even those who may not have gone through a process to determine whether they have a well-founded fear of persecution. So they may not be technically refugees under the convention, but they have common characteristics.
Yeah,
and so are there protections that apply, more broadly then to this broader group of people?
Well, the world community treats them as refugees, not just UNHCR. Anyone fleeing conflict or violence basically now is treated like a refugee. And interestingly, neither Lebanon nor Jordan have signed the convention, but they treat these people as if they were refugees, and that's how the international community treats them, and they provide money to take care of them and the like. And there are other countries that have signed the convention that have been less open. So the signing of the convention is not the touchstone for whether or not someone will be protected. It's actually how the world community responds. And people fleeing violence and conflict are generally treated like refugees and protected. People fleeing other causes like climate are less likely to be so treated, and that's where the norms really need to develop.
So this really raises the question of the U.S. role in providing protection for refugees, whether they're overseas in a country that they've fled to or whether they're resettled here, because you've both talked about the incredible burden that many neighboring states face, the number of refugees that flow to countries that join them. But I'm interested in hearing a little bit more, drawing on your vast experience, about the role the U.S. has played in refugee protection and resettlement over time, and also whether there's been a bipartisan consensus on these issues. Sam, why don't we start with you?
I'll start on that. The United States helps the international refugee situation in quite a few different ways. In the last year or two, there's been, as you know, a ton of attention on the refugee admissions program. Should we let in so many Syrians? Should we let in this population? What should the numbers be from what parts of the world? And those are extremely important issues. And it's appropriate that they're discussed a lot within the executive branch and discussed with Congress and so forth. At the same time, it's important to recognize that the number of refugees who are involved in any kind of resettlement is less than 1% of the overall population worldwide of refugees. Most US funding and most of the international effort around the world, including UNHCR, is on helping people in place. It could be in a refugee camp, it could be in an urban setting, it could be people in motion. And when I was involved as a State Department official dealing with the refugee program, the vast majority, I'd say, this isn't mathematically exact, but 70 or 75% of our funding was not the refugee admissions program, but it was funding UNHCR, funding the International Committee of the Red Cross, international NGOs, working with other countries in helping with the immediate urgency of someone who's left their country and is in a second country and in need of help. And the assistance from the United States was from the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Also, USAID plays a role in terms of bilateral assistance to countries that are coping with the issue of a massive influx of refugees and their own population. My own experience from 2009, 2010 was that the Iraqis, I was involved in the response to the Iraqi refugee crisis. Iraqis were in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, as Alex noted, and other countries. But in Jordan, for example, US assistance was both through UNHCR, it was and related and NGOs that were working with UNHCR on their own to provide relief. It was also bilateral assistance. US Agency for International Development also had programs that the US would help Jordan through bilateral assistance. So in respect to your question, a lot of effort and thought in US work goes internationally to the international organizations and NGOs. We get a lot of attention for the admissions program, and that's important, but I have to emphasize that that is one small part. A lot of people are not seeking to return, to move to the United States, although many are. Most probably would be happy to go back to their homes, communities, jobs, and families in their first country. Others, realizing that that may not be possible, would like to stay safely in that country that they've arrived in or another neighboring country. The admissions program is extremely important, and it has helped many, I think the number is 3 million or more since the 70s. But it is one part of the broader picture of the way the U.S. acts internationally in this area.
Alex?
Well, I'd just add to that, the United States was the world leader on refugee protection, believing in the norms, in money it gave through humanitarian development and through the refugee resettlement program. It no longer is. Starting with the Obama administration, in fact, the detention of families and children on the southwest border, of people fleeing the Northern Triangle countries, and in order to deter the flow, I think was quite problematic. And the asylum process inside the United States is now broken. It takes 2, 3, 4 years to have an asylum case heard. That happened in previous years. The Trump administration added to that by reducing the number of refugees to be admitted. Under the Obama administration, it had been set at 110,000. That represented more than all the other countries of the world combined. The Trump administration, without any explanation, cut that to 50,000. Just by a stroke of the pen. And more importantly, I think it's the rhetoric that's gone on around refugees and the seen as security risks and the problems that refugees bring that has just colored the way refugees are talked about now, that has been very deleterious. So I think the United States has lost its lead in refugee protection, and I think that's a sad thing.
So say a little bit more about the process by which refugees are screened and vetted and so forth, because that has been, as you say, been a source of some controversy publicly and rhetoric and so forth. Could you say a little bit about that and what's involved? And
the president has talked about the need for extreme vetting for people coming in, and I think there are security issues for all immigrants that need to be addressed. It's unquestionable. The problem is that there already was extreme vetting for refugees through a number of reforms that have been put in over the last few years. Refugees have more interviews, more security checks than any other group of immigrants coming to the United States, and therefore it's not surprising that not a single terrorist act in the United States has been committed by someone admitted as a refugee. So the idea that we needed more on top of that to secure us, I think, was a canard.
So you also talked about the numbers of refugees that are admitted, and it'd be helpful to know, maybe Sam, you can talk about this. Who decides? It sounds like the executive has a lot of discretion in deciding the numbers. I mean, what's the role of the executive? What's the role of Congress in determining the numbers of refugees that we take, from what geographic areas they come, and so forth?
Sure. Well, there's an annual process of a lot of discussion between the State Department and DHS in particular about the upcoming year's refugee admissions program. And that discussion has a number of components. One is sort of what is the overall number, the ceiling that will be presented to Congress in the consultations. And the number this year that the Obama administration had established for fiscal 17 was 110,000. And it was reduced to 50 by the new president. The process is kind of exhaustive because it involves anticipating UNHCR referrals, considering the capacity of U.S. agencies to interview and identify and safely get these people to the United States. It involves a discussion of priority regions of the world and priority countries. So in the document that's presented each year by the executive to the Congress, there are identified by region, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, a number. Several, it could be 5 to 10,000, or it could be 25,000. The issue is both geographically where the anticipated group will be, and also what the aggregate number will be. So, for example, the 110,000 was broken down by regions and was the result of a lot of consultations with UNHCR, consultations with the resettlement agencies in the United States that would be responsible for handling refugees after they're admitted. It's considerations of how much money would be available, because there's money on both ends for the United States to fund all of we hire contractors to help with the processing. For International Rescue Committee, World Relief, and other groups are actually in camps, in locations around the world interviewing, and that costs money. We do travel loans to get the refugees to the United States. We help fund the United States government through an HHS program, helps fund their initial months in the United States. There's also an unallocated reserve. So when you think about the chart of overall refugee admissions to the United States, it's not merely the regions, although that's the vast majority. There's an acknowledgement in the consultation with Congress that there will be some amount of refugees that we can't anticipate, that we know 5 or 10,000, for example, there might be a blow up of a situation in Africa or Asia or the Middle East, and we don't allocate every number in the consultations. So the process involves developing that number in consultation with DHS, along with the discussion of the procedures and capacity, and sharing that with our international partners, presenting it and discussing it with Congress.
But it does sound like in the end, the executive makes the call on the numbers. Is that correct? Yeah. With all this consultation, and I'm interested in going back to Alex's earlier point that the U.S. has been a leader in refugee assistance and resettlement historically, and that there have been some changes in recent years. And it'd be interesting to hear more about what might lead to moving back toward a greater leadership role. I mean, there are lots of local communities that welcome refugees. There are lots of church groups. There are lots of NGOs. There's a lot of support around the country in different parts of the country for welcoming refugees. So if you could say a little bit about what might help lead us back to a more profound leadership role on these issues.
Well, that'll have to be a political decision. There could be popular support could be important. One option people have talked about is schemes of private sponsorship. Currently, as Sam's explained, it's all handled through the federal government. But Canada, for example, for 20 or 30 years, has permitted private groups or family members to bring in refugees. So people still have to meet the criteria. They're still screened on security grounds, but then their travel and their care for the first year is paid for by a private group. And through that, you've been able to double the number of admissions. I think there could be private sponsorship in the United States. I would think the current administration might be in favor of that because they'd still have the security screening, but it wouldn't cost the federal government anything. And I think it would be really a wonderful way for the American people to show that they strongly believe in the refugee program. My guess is if we went out with a program like this, we could double refugee admissions in the country. That's one possibility. Another possibility people have begun to talk about are city-to-city exchanges. So it's neither public nor private. It's sort of a hybrid where the city of New York could say to the Beirut, we'll take 1,000 refugees on a city-to-city kind of exchange. Again, would have to go through the federal system, but it wouldn't come at cost to the federal taxpayer.
So the vetting and the screening and all the insurance that people meet, whatever security criteria, would be a federal process, but there would be assistance provided, as you suggest, in these other ways. Yeah. I mean, is that something that you think has some potential for bipartisan support? Both of you have engaged with Congress, you've engaged with executive, you've served in the executive branch. Is this the kind of thing that might enjoy some support, do you think?
Well, it seems to me that there will be communities of all different flavors here. There are some communities that, for whatever reason, have stepped forward brilliantly and helped with refugees and welcomed them. There are some, even when I was dealing from 2007 to 2010, there were some communities that were anxious about refugee admissions. And with a proper explanation, we were able to overcome most questions that people had. Who are these people? How were they vetted? And so forth. We're in a different and more challenging political environment now than I think we were back in those days. And I think a part of that was the presidential campaign. A part of that were events in Europe that have nothing to do with the U.S. refugee admissions program, but have caught people's attention. I do think that there is a real positive mood in this country outside of political circles to welcome refugees. Since the travel bans were announced by the president, I've been invited to a couple of religious institutions where these are congregations that are very, very interested in what is this refugee program, how can we help. One religious institution that I spoke at actually has adopted a Syrian, so to speak, a Syrian family, and has gone so far as to help with clothing, help with English language, because obviously the language barrier for many refugees is pretty huge, and help them with transition. And anecdotally, I've only been exposed to 2 or 3 religious institutions that are engaged, but anecdotally, you hear about that a lot. And I know, for example, the resettlement agencies, when refugees come into the United States, there are quite a few religious institutions. I don't know what the numbers are, but the U.S. Conference on Catholic Bishops was about 1/3 when I was managing or helping manage the refugee program. And the Lutheran and HIAS and a lot of other organizations were extremely active. I think there's a ton of generosity in the United States and sympathy and understanding of refugees. And I think a lot of the negative publicity that's been generated is really not generated up from cities and states and congregations and people, but it was a part of the presidential campaign and is a part of this newer political dialogue that I certainly didn't experience a few years ago when I was helping with the response to the Iraqi refugee crisis. I would go up with colleagues from the State Department to Capitol Hill, talk to appropriators, and the questions were, tell us more about the populations, what do you anticipate happening in the next 6 months, what are the needs of this population, as opposed to, we're frightened, we don't want to take in more people because we don't know who they are. It was the kind of response that I found very heartening. And in my career at the State Department, I encountered a lot of partisanship on other issues with respect to Capitol Hill. But on the issue of refugee relief and including the resettlement program, it was a breath of fresh air. I really was fortunate to be exposed to the bipartisanship that existed at the time. And sadly, I think a lot of that has been lost recently. I'm hoping, as Alex said, that it recovers and that there's a new and more charitable attitude. And I think it'll be coming up from the people in a way, because I do think this is a generous country, and I do think that people care about refugee relief and about resettlement, and they get that these are people who are the victims of circumstance. They don't want to be refugees. No one wants to have left their home and their community and their family and go to a strange place under terrible conditions. And if the United States can do more to help these folks resettle, that's great. And I think our country is great enough to rebound from the current political dialogue.
So that leads to the discussion. Both of you have alluded to the executive order of the administration, which, as we know, banned entry of citizens from a number of countries that are Muslim majority nations, and also ordered a temporary halt to refugee arrivals. The federal courts have enjoined those orders, and they will likely go to the Supreme Court. And I'm interested in your sense of the major issues, both legal and practical, raised by the executive order. And Alex, maybe we can start with you on that.
Well, the practical order with the first order was the chaos it created, because people already were in motion. There were people with green cards trying to come back, and refugees had been screened and ready to come in. So it was just poorly drafted, and that was quickly realized, and the court stopped it. And we have the second order. As you said, there are 2 parts to it. One is the ban on people coming from particular countries, and the second is the pause or the stop of the refugee program overall for 120 days, while supposedly more screening is developed. We're getting actually close to the end of those periods. We'll have to see actually what happens. The courts have stopped these programs, and they've been attacked on a range of grounds. I think the 2 most serious, one is it was religious discrimination that Mr. Trump had made clear during the campaign that this was a Muslim ban. He wanted Muslims not to come in. They tried to dress it up in other kinds of legal language, but the courts have looked through that and said, in fact, this was a religious ban. And even though the president has really very wide authority to, as Sam described, to designate particular countries and groups of people who should come in on the refugee program. That doesn't mean you can use an impermissible ground, and religious discrimination would be one of them. There are also claims under the Immigration Act that the act prohibits the discrimination in handing out of visas. There are claims that the security grounds that were put forward weren't substantiated because the countries where most terrorists came from were not the countries that were banned from coming in. So there are a range of claims, but I think the one that has stuck most been hardest for the courts to get over, and the reason they have put this all on hold is because of the religious ban. And I would say, even, sort of speaking contemporaneously, even the last 2 or 3 days, the president has been issuing statements through Twitter that reinforce his view that this was in fact a travel ban, even though members of the administration had said it's not a ban, it's just a pause. He has undercut members of his own administration, saying, no, it's a ban, that's what we wanted. And I think that may well hurt him in the courts.
I would add to that just my observation, because like many law firms around the country, my law firm, Arnold & Porter, is involved in one of these challenges, which is on behalf of the Iranian American community, both the four national groups and a lot of individuals. The order had, as Alex said, an immediate disruptive effect. It also had broader ripple effects that I don't think we entirely know at this point. It was an act that was unfamiliar to the rest of the world as a U.S. act, because of the symbolism of the U.S. being welcoming to refugees and immigrants. It was dissonant, certainly with my experience in being a U.S. representative at the UN and elsewhere through the years, to the way other countries reacted to us. I think that our leadership in some ways has been diminished. Alex has talked about it specifically in the context of the refugee program, and I agree 100% with that. But the executive orders were a statement of fear, and a statement of concern, in addition to the issue of it potentially being discriminatory based on religion. And I know that is certainly an allegation in our case, and the courts have found for that. It has a resonance for those of us that grew up in diplomacy and in international law. I keep coming back to the word unfamiliar. It was unfamiliar to me that this country would take an action that would cut off the refugee program after decades of building it, to cut off the Syrian parts of the program after the endless conversations between state and DHS on getting that right, or as right as possible, by way of security vetting, and to identify individual countries that aren't necessarily the source of the problem, to follow through on developments in political developments in the last year or two. So for me, it certainly has all of the legal issues, and I suspect that the cases will continue. I know the Justice Department is trying to stay other cases while the Supreme Court takes the Fourth Circuit case. But I think that there are ripple effects that are pretty substantial with these executive orders.
So one of the arguments made is the need to bolster, strengthen, review the screening or vetting processes by which people are, have come into this country through visas, but also the refugee program. And we talked earlier about that. I mean, are there improvements that need to be made in those screening processes?
I think they'll find on the refugee side, there's not much they can do. They'll come up with a few tweaks probably and say they've now made it safe. But it was such a comprehensive process beforehand, it's going to be hard to show that there was much more that could be done. And if you go to a refugee camp and you see the people who come in, or you come to the resettling communities in the United States, you meet these people. These are often women with kids and young people, and it's just clear that these are people in need. Not so naive to think that people can't do harm in some other way, but as I said, there've been no crimes, no terrorist acts committed by the hundreds of thousands of refugees that have been admitted. Now remember, the ban did two things. It applied the refugee situation and also on the visa situation.
Exactly.
And there may be strengthening on the visa side that would be a good idea, and that's open to DHS and state and other organizations to say we could make this tighter, and we should do that. We should be as secure as we can in people we admit, but we shouldn't adopt a program that's based on other motivations.
I should, Jen, if I could just mention one thing that that is relevant to the refugee interview process. It's face-to-face on the part of DHS interviewers. I know I was a state guy, but I would travel in my role as a refugee program official, and I was in all different parts of the world, and I would sit watching, listening with great respect, the incredible diligence of DHS.
DHS, the Department of Homeland Security.
Department of Homeland Security, which actually sends interviewers worldwide to meet with potential refugees. So the prospect that we have no idea, we haven't spoken with these people, we don't know, is not actually accurate, because lots of people have vetted. They're referred typically by UN High Commissioner for Refugee staff. They are interviewed by an organization that's been carefully vetted by US government officials to do an initial screening. DHS sends people who are well-trained to meet with folks. In the same way that consular officers are trained to try to figure out who's an intending immigrant and who's a real non-immigrant visa applicant. These DHS folks are very conscious of the security. Their job and credibility is on the line. Their signature goes at the bottom of a page. They've made a determination that someone is appropriate. And there are additional screenings. And now, since I left the program a few years ago, and Alex had been at UNHCR watching the US evolve in terms of the additional vetting, it's a very sophisticated process. And we do know who these people are. You can't ever rule out that there are people who are potentially in the future going to be problematic. You can't do that in any immigration program. But the refugee program is more careful than any other immigration program. It's a humanitarian matter. Most of these people are women and young people, children. The vast majority of people at refugee camps are vulnerable women and children. And the idea of the United States, which has to be right, is that we can do quite a good job figuring out who these people are. We're not going to admit cases if we perceive the risk to be too high. And that's what we do. That's what we've always done.
So we've talked about the international framework. We've talked about some of the challenges refugees face, the domestic process, and some recent legal controversies. But I'm interested in sort of thinking broadly, looking forward. Are there certain priorities you think the United States should pursue, both in the immediate term, but also maybe over the next decade or so, with regard to treatment of refugees? Alex.
Well, if I can briefly mention, I guess, three, some the government should pursue and some lawyers should pursue. The first is really the changing paradigm on the ground of how we take care of refugees. Because these situations go on for so long, you simply can't leave people in camps. You can't just give them humanitarian aid forever. You have to give them a right to work, a right to take care of themselves and their families. And the big change that's happened here is the intervention of the World Bank and some other development actors who've come in and said, displacement is a development issue. When we have a large group of people in a country that itself may be fragile or developing state, they need development assistance for the hosting community and for the refugees to get people working. And that has shifted things from a humanitarian to a development perspective. It's been mentioned for years, but it's now really taking hold. The World Bank has put aside $2 billion for this, and so that's into the future. It seems to be very important. The second is something, as I mentioned, was left out of the original convention, which is a formal structure for responsibility sharing, so that you don't simply have people stay in the countries that they first got to, and that the U.S. could show leadership on trying to bring the countries of the world together to put that in place. The third, which I would leave to international lawyers, I guess, more likely, is a campaign for international refugee rights. As I mentioned, refugees are denied rights in almost every country in the world. They're not, and the convention was a human rights convention. It was adopted at the time of the human rights conventions. followed the Declaration by a few years on human rights, and came before us the covenants and other human rights instruments. So we need to see it in that picture. And yet refugee rights are routinely violated. And I've been to lots of international conferences on refugees. I've never been to a conference of lawyers saying, what about an international campaign to enforce refugee rights in courts, through political action, and the like? And I think this is time for that now.
And when you say refugee rights, I assume you're not just saying the technical folks who have a well-founded fear of persecution, but a more broad scope, or how would you define
Well,
that?
I think we're treating as refugees anybody who flees conflict and violence, whether or not they come within the narrow definition. So I would include all those people. But the kinds of rights would be a right to work, a right to movement, encampment policies of states that force people to live in camps are illegal under international law, detention of people at borders, and unfair treatment where they're in fact forced to go home because they're not permitted in to make a claim. There are a whole range of kinds of claims that could be made by international lawyers.
So one thing, and it goes to maybe your first point, many countries that are the countries of first asylum, where massive numbers of refugees flee, face an enormous economic challenge and burden with welcoming all these refugees. And their local populations may feel, this massive influx of refugees is overwhelming us. They're competing for jobs, they're competing for positions in schools and so forth. And so are there ways of addressing the concerns of host communities and maybe figuring out a positive way to engage with the host communities and also protect the refugees? Could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I'll say very quickly, and I'll turn to Sam. I mean, I think there are two things to do. One is to have more people resettled out, and either through a formal resettlement program or people now talking about kind of labor mobility so people can move to jobs elsewhere. But you have to relieve those border countries of having all the refugees there. And the second would be increase in development aid. You can't simply, you can't say to a country X, we're going to take development aid we give you for your citizens, now you got to give it to refugees. That won't work. But if you say you keep the development aid you have, but we're going to give you an extra amount for refugee hosting areas, then I think you can see some changes on the ground.
To pick up on that, I think it's important to emphasize the stability issues in both obviously the country where people are fleeing. There's a reason they're fleeing. There's internal conflict, there's persecution, there are differences of various kinds. When they come to a second country, the United States historically has been, as Alex highlighted, very mindful of the stability of that country of first asylum. The issues, for example, in Lebanon, which has is a fragile government to begin with, and it has multiple populations of now Syrians on top of Iraqis and Palestinians and everybody else. Jordan facing some of the same issues. Turkey's facing some of the same issues. These are issues that don't go away, unfortunately, simply because the next crisis happens doesn't mean that the population that led to the previous crisis in that country is vanished. So you have these encrusted problems in fragile countries. So I think a part is, I mentioned, for example, the United States historically, both through the multilateral institutions like UNHCR and the ICRC, are very involved in relief efforts through a global infrastructure. But there's no substitute for caring about bilateral assistance for these governments. Again, back to Jordan, where I visited several times in connection with the Iraqi refugee crisis. We gave them assistance because the assistance through UNHCR and the ICRC had crucial functions. It helped maintain the protection that an international institution could provide. But Jordan was in a great need of additional assistance because of basics, education, health, and jobs. And it's like that in Kenya with hundreds of thousands of Somalis who were in Dadaab or in Nairobi or elsewhere, who really, Kenya's often been a very fragile government, and it's facing this city in the middle of its country that has, hundreds of thousands of Somalis. And the same thing, the situation of Burmese in Thailand was facilitated because the UNHCR and other international organizations set up a stable series of camps in Western Thailand that enabled Thailand to not have to devote all of its own resources to dealing with Burmese. That would have been a situation that would have been untenable. So you could go on and picture a map of the world. There are all these situations, but I agree 100% with Alex that development assistance and development support is crucial, because you can't just look to where did these people come from? Can't we fix that situation? Often you can't, or if you can, it won't be the same country that they came from, because that country doesn't really exist anymore after the chaos in Syria, after ethnic fighting in other countries. So you have to deal with the fact, sadly, that people will be on the move, and people will be frightened, and people will be jobless and lonely and separated from their loved ones. So it takes rigor, it takes time, it takes, unfortunately, often decades for people who've been uprooted to find some stability. In the camps, for example, in Kenya that I visited, there were children that had grown up in those camps and didn't know anything else. And that, you need job training, you need safety, you need sanitation, you need health, you need everything just to help these people survive in that country of first asylum.
So you raised the Syrian refugee situation, and the scope and the challenges it poses are really quite extraordinary. And Alex, you quite recently were serving as Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees. I wonder if you could say a bit about that conflict and that crisis, and what the international community is doing, what more should be done to address the situation.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a horror.
Yeah.
I mean, 250,000 people dead, 5 million people outside their country, 10 or 11 million people displaced inside. It's just a horrible situation. It's unfortunately demonstrated the inability of the Security Council of the United Nations to resolve conflict. The UN was set up for peace and security, and it's not accomplished that in Syria for well-known reasons. So the humanitarians are left to pick up the pieces. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, the existence of a humanitarian system almost permits atrocities to go on, because the international community picks up the pieces outside and doesn't hold the people causing the crisis responsible for what they have actually caused. And we need to think about that as a matter of international accountability at some point about people who cause large refugee flows. The international community has responded with a lot of money for assistance, not enough, but a lot. The problem has been there hasn't been adequate resettlement, and there hasn't been adequate coordination between the humanitarian and the development actors. I'm a little surprised over the 5-year period. I'm very surprised that there has not been a global conference on Syrian refugees called by the President of the United States, the Secretary General, mm-hmm. the President of the World Bank, and name a couple of other people if you need to, Russians, Iranians, whoever. There have been attempts to solve the war, which haven't succeeded, and there have been pledging conferences where people come in and say, we'll give more money, but there hasn't been an attempt for a comprehensive solution. And maybe that'll require peace first before we can get to that point. But the Global North has addressed it mainly by donating a lot of money to the problem, not by solving the crisis or by taking Syrians in.
Yeah, no, I think you raised the issue of accountability. The issue of addressing the underlying causes is so vital and so important to address. And there are certainly parts of the international community and the U.S. government that focus on these issues, focus on issues of justice and accountability for some of the atrocities that drive people away, drive them from their countries. And but more needs to be done clearly on that score. Sam, I didn't know if you wanted to add a little bit more about ideas for reforms going forward. Is there anything you'd like to put on the table in that regard?
In terms of going forward, I think that the infrastructure in international refugee relief has been well thought out. I agree with Alex that there are initiatives that are needed, more focus on Syria. I agree with you on accountability. It does seem to me that in the next year or two, the U.S. will really have a decision to make in terms of its own leadership in these areas. I believe that there is bipartisan interest in the international relief, meaning you step away from the refugee admissions program and you think about the importance both for stability and humanitarianism of helping the world address refugee issues. The refugee admissions program will continue to be a divisive issue, which is something I would never have expected just 3 years ago, but that seems to have evolved. But I think that, as I said a few minutes ago, that the United States has been a leader and can continue to be a leader in all aspects, including the admissions program.
So if you could give one bit of advice to the current administration, what would it be?
I think it would be to change the rhetoric. The word refugee was always a nonpartisan word. It was a wonderful word in the United States. We are a country of refugees in many ways. Probably 1 out of every 100 Americans is a refugee, if we take the number of admissions over the last few years, and many more are related to them. We've lost that. The word refugee now has a different taint to it because of what people have said. And I think we need to reclaim the word as a word of safety and hope and promise and humanitarian work.
And all I would add to that is that I do think that there's a real role for a bottom-up effort here. I mentioned the congregations that I've spoken with. Communities care, people do care. These NGOs and many members of Congress do care if you ask. It used to be a unifying issue of the religious right and the left. And I think just if you go down at the first few levels, it still is, but there's a political divide that didn't exist. So I would encourage law students, academics, people, leaders in state and local government to continue explaining that this is a country that values refugees, that respects what they've been through, and that we believe it is an essential part of the mission of the United States to help them.
Thank you so much for your participation in this conversation, Alex, Sam. It's been incredibly illuminating. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
And now I'll turn it over to Lucinda Lowe, who's the president of the American Society of International Law.
Jane, thank you very much for your leadership in moderating this session, and thanks to both of our speakers, Alex Alenikoff and Sam Whitten, for a very important discussion. These are issues that are not going to go away. Indeed, many believe that with phenomena like climate change, which was mentioned briefly in the discussion, that we're going to be seeing many more events that give rise to displacement of persons, and that will contribute to the issues that our panel has been discussing. So thanks to you both, thanks to you all for clarifying the international framework and for highlighting some of the challenges and opportunities and initiatives in this area. This is an issue on which the society has been engaged and will continue to be engaged. And finally, thank you to our audience. We hope you found this webcast informative and useful. If you would like to view it again or share it with others, the link is going to be available shortly at www.asil.org/100days. In the coming weeks, we will be offering additional programs in this series, including on topics such as cyberspace, nuclear nonproliferation, and others. So please look for updates from ASIL either on our website or through social media. Thank you very much.